He hated the sound of a dog whining. Always had. Even before the war, before Afghanistan, before the thing that happened in the Panjshir Valley that he still couldn't put a name to without his hands going tight. But it was a different kind of hate now, the kind that lived in the chest and pulled downward. His name was Garrett Nolan, and he had been alone for 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days. Not that he was counting. The cabin outside Cochrane, Alberta, sat at the end of a gravel road that most people gave up on before the second bend. That was the point. The nearest town was 40 minutes in good weather. He had a wood stove, a chest freezer, a satellite dish he barely used, and a photograph of a woman with red hair standing in front of Bow Lake that he kept face down on the kitchen counter because turning it over was still something he couldn't do before noon. He did not want a dog. He had been clear about that, internally, in the way a man is clear about things when there is no one left to say them to. The morning it started, he had driven into Cochrane for propane and diesel, and a bag of the dark roast coffee that was the only thing besides sleep that he still took any pleasure in. It was the 3rd week of November. The highway was dry, but the fields on either side held the gray look of a season that had already made up its mind. He loaded the truck and stopped at the hardware store and did not talk to anyone more than necessary, which was his ordinary. The woman at the till had asked if he was getting ready for the cold, and he had said yes, and she had said it was supposed to be a bad one this year, and he had nodded and taken his change and left. He was pulling out of the lot when he saw the dog. She was on the shoulder of the road between the hardware store and the co-op, sitting very still in a way that dogs don't usually sit, the way that means something is wrong with them. She was a German shepherd, big-boned and young, maybe 2 years old, with a thick black and tan coat that was matted with mud along the belly and one back leg that she was holding off the ground. A car had already passed her, then another. She watched each one with the same expression. Not desperate, not even afraid, really. Just watching, in that particular way shepherds have, like they are waiting for the one specific person who is going to understand. Garrett kept driving. He made it approximately 3 blocks. He sat at the intersection with the left turn signal on, watching the light, and the light changed, and he did not move. And the car behind him waited, politely Canadian about the whole thing. And then he put the truck in reverse and went back. He had told himself, pulling up alongside her, putting the hazards on, getting out in the cold, that this was not a rescue. This was a temporary situation. This was a man with a truck and a dog on the side of the road in November and a basic ethical minimum that did not require any further commitment. She let him approach without flinching. That was the first thing. He crouched down and she looked at him with those amber eyes, and he looked at her leg and it wasn't broken. He didn't think, but something was wrong with the paw, swollen, the pad split on one side, dried blood darkened around the edges. She'd been walking on it for a while. Long enough. He said, "Don't bite me." She didn't. He lifted her. She was heavier than she looked, solid and warm, and put her in the back seat and got back in the truck. He sat there for a moment with the hazards still clicking. "I'm taking you to the vet," he said. "That's it." She put her nose against the back of his seat and exhaled once, a long, slow breath that fogged the fabric, and then she lay down. He drove her to the vet. The vet's name was Dr. Patricia Ma, and she had the particular calm of someone who had seen every kind of animal emergency and every kind of person who brought them in, and she did not comment on the fact that Garrett had brought in a stray he clearly had no intention of keeping. She examined the paw and said the pad was lacerated and infected, probably from road salt and ice, possibly from something she'd stepped on, and that it would need to be cleaned and bandaged and kept dry, and that the dog was otherwise healthy, youngish, not spayed, no chip, no tattoo. "Someone's dog?" Garrett said. "Could be. Could have been. She's not been eating great, but she's not starving." He looked at the dog, who was sitting on the examination table looking back at him. "I can hold her a few days," Dr. Ma said. "See if anyone claims her." He said that was fine, and he gave his number and went home. He made it 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, he drove back and said he'd take her until someone came for her. Dr. Ma handed him the bandaging supplies and a bottle of antibiotics, and a look that said she had seen this before, too. He named her nothing. He called her the dog. The cabin had one main room with the kitchen along the south wall and the wood stove in the northwest corner, and a worn leather couch that had come with the place. There was a loft above where Garrett slept. The dog took to the couch immediately, which he did not allow, and then to the hooked rug in front of the wood stove, which he allowed, and by the fourth evening she was sleeping with her chin on his boot while he read, and he had decided not to address this either. Her paw was healing. She favored it less each day. By the end of the first week, she was moving around the cabin freely, investigating everything with a seriousness that was almost professional. She checked every corner. She put her nose against the baseboards. She found the face-down photograph on the kitchen counter and sniffed the back of the frame for a long time and then looked at him. He was watching from across the room. "Leave it," he said. She left it. He didn't sleep well. This was not new. He hadn't slept well since before Isabel died, since before the diagnosis, before the 2 years of fighting it, before the January morning in the Foothills Hospital when everything had become before and after. And the sleeplessness had its own texture now, familiar and dense, less like insomnia and more like a room he returned to each night with the lights off. He lay in the loft and listened to the stove tick as it cooled, and sometimes to the wind off the ridge, and now newly to the dog shifting on the rug below. She didn't whine. He had braced for that. She didn't whimper or bark in the night, or make the sounds he had expected. She was quiet in the way of a working dog that knows the difference between a sound that matters and one that doesn't. He found himself, on the 9th night, listening for her breathing. The person who called about the dog was a woman named Sandra Tremblay, who had seen the notice Dr. Ma had posted on the community board in Cochrane. She called on a Thursday afternoon and said yes, that sounded like her daughter's dog. Her daughter Kylie had been living out past Jumping Pound Creek and had moved suddenly in October, gone back to Ontario, and Sandra was pretty sure she'd taken the dog, but maybe not. Garrett said he'd keep her until they confirmed. Sandra said she'd call Kylie. Sandra did not call back. He waited 2 weeks, because he was a man who kept agreements even with himself, and then he drove to the Animal Registry office in Cochrane and filled out the paperwork to transfer ownership. The woman behind the desk asked if he had a name for the registration, and he looked at the dog, who was sitting beside him, looking at the woman behind the desk with professional seriousness. He said, "Ridgeland." He had not planned to say that. It was the name of a ridge in the Panchir Valley that he had walked once in the early morning, and that he had thought about more times than he could count since, not because of what had happened there, but because of the 20 minutes before, when it had been utterly quiet and the light was coming sideways over the peaks and he had felt something close to peace. The woman typed it in. On the walk back to the truck, Ridgeline walked at his left knee, unhauled, as if she had been doing it for years. He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what there was to say. The thing about a German Shepherd, when you're not used to one, is that they take up more space than their body. They're present in a room in a way that other dogs aren't. Ridgeline would lie on the rug, and the whole room knew she was there. She tracked movement without appearing to track it. She noted arrivals. She had opinions about what time they should go to bed, expressed through a sustained, pointed look from across the room, and opinions about what they should do in the morning, expressed by appearing at the bottom of the loft ladder at 6:15 with the same expression. She also had, within the first 3 weeks, done the following. She had taken one of Garrett's good wool socks, one, not the pair, and carried it to her rug and slept with it for 6 days before he found it. She had discovered with apparent glee that the corner of the back porch where the firewood was stacked created a resonant hollow sound if she walked on the specific board at the north end, and she had walked on this board, apparently just to hear the sound, approximately 40 times before he realized what she was doing. She had sat outside the bathroom door every single morning, with the expression of someone managing a very complicated logistics operation, and she had, on a Sunday when he had driven to Cochrane and left her with the run of the cabin for 4 hours, rearranged the throw pillows on the couch into what could only be described as a considered arrangement, with the largest one against the arm and the 2 smaller ones stacked neatly against it, as if she had been waiting to do this for some time and finally had the privacy. He came home, looked at the couch, looked at her. She looked back at him with complete composure. "Ridgeline," he said. She wagged once, slowly, like a judge rendering a verdict. He hadn't talked about Isabel in a long time. He had talked at her, in the way you do, in the truck, at the wood stove, once standing at the edge of the frozen pond behind the cabin, watching the sun go down in February. But that was different from talking about her to someone else, which required putting her into words that other people would receive, and that felt like a reduction of something that couldn't be reduced. He talked to Ridgeline. He wasn't sure when it started. Somewhere in the second month, he'd be splitting wood and find himself saying something, and the dog would be sitting nearby listening, not with the half-attention of a creature waiting for something interesting to happen, but with genuine focus. The ears slightly forward, the eyes on his face. He told her about meeting Isabel at a trail race outside Canmore in 2004, when she had stopped to help him tape a blister. A complete stranger, crouched in the dirt, doing it efficiently and without being asked, and then standing up and handing him back his shoe and saying, "You'll be fine." It's not deep in the voice of someone with no patience for self-pity, and how he had been entirely finished from that moment. He told her about the house in Langdon, about the way Isabel always burned toast and refused to acknowledge it and ate it anyway, about how she had come to every single one of his homecomings with coffee and a complete absence of drama, which was the thing he had needed most and never had to ask for. He told her about the diagnosis, and about the 2 years, and about the morning in January. He wasn't crying, or maybe he was, slightly, in the way that happens in cold air when you're not paying attention. Ridgeline pushed her nose against his knee. He put his hand on top of her head and left it there. The second dog arrived in March. There was no warning. In the way there is rarely warning for the things that change the structure of a life. Garrett had been running the old logging road that cut north from the property. He'd been running again since October. Another thing that had happened without his entirely deciding to. And he was about 4 kilometers out when he heard it. A dog. Small, young, from the pitch of it, coming from somewhere off the east side of the road, where the land dropped into a creek bed that was still iced over in the shade of the spruce. He stopped. Ridgeline stopped beside him and looked at the tree line. He should keep going. He knew that. He had a rule, which was that the dog he currently had was the last dog he was going to take in, and that was a firm rule and it was still in operation. He walked into the trees. The dog in the creek bed was a puppy, 8 or 10 weeks, a shepherd cross of some kind with oversized paws and ears that hadn't decided what direction to go yet. It had somehow gotten down into the bank and couldn't get back up. The ice was breaking at the edge, and it kept scrabbling and sliding back, soaking and shaking. With the particular expression of a creature that has been working on a problem much longer than it had the resources for, Ridgeline was already at the bank before him. She lay down flat on the ice, which distributed her weight, and extended her nose toward the puppy, who grabbed on with both front paws. Garrett got in behind her, broke through the ice into 6 inches of water which was extremely cold, and lifted the puppy out. He stood in the creek holding a soaking, shaking, mud-colored puppy that weighed approximately 4 pounds and was already trying to climb his face. "No," he said. The puppy climbed his face. Ridgeline watched from the bank with the expression of someone who had planned this. He called him Knox, after the township north of Kingston, where Isabel had grown up, where her parents still lived, where they had driven every Christmas in a truck that ran cold in the winter and listened to the CBC the whole way, and argued pleasantly about whether it was faster to go through Barrie or bypass it. Knox was, in personality, the opposite of Ridgeline in almost every way that mattered. Where Ridgeline was precise, Knox was approximate. Where Ridgeline observed, Knox acted immediately and assessed consequences later, usually with an expression of genuine surprise that consequences had occurred. He broke 3 things in his first week: a coffee mug, the corner of the rug near the wood stove, and the ambient peace of the cabin, which he disrupted simply by being present in it, with his enormous puppy energy and his inability to sleep past 5 a.m. He also attached himself to Ridgeline with a completeness that she accepted with enormous dignity. She let him sleep against her. She tolerated, with the patience of a very senior employee, dealing with an enthusiastic new hire, his attempts to initiate play at moments that were obviously inappropriate. When he fell off the porch step, twice, the same step, on consecutive days, She went and stood over him and waited until he had recovered his bearings before walking away. She did not make a fuss. She simply noted that he was a fool and that she was keeping an eye on him. Garrett watched all of this. He started sleeping better somewhere in April. The day Garrett turned the photograph over was a Wednesday in early May, a week after Knox had managed to pull it off the kitchen counter entirely and carry it across the room and set it. Face down, intact, not a scratch on the glass, on the floor beside the wood stove, where he then sat next to it, with an air of having delivered something important. Garrett had stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at this for a long time. He had picked up the photograph and brought it to the table and sat down and turned it over. Isabel, standing in front of Bow Lake in September, squinting slightly because the light was coming straight off the water. She had her hair back because it was windy. She was wearing the gray fleece jacket that she'd had since before they met and refused to replace. She was 31 in the photograph and she looked like herself, entirely and without effort, which was the thing about her that he had spent 2 years trying to describe to people after she died and had never gotten right. He sat there for a long time. Knox had climbed onto the bench beside him and was pressing his warm body against Garrett's ribs. Ridgeline sat on the floor with her head on his knee. The stove ticked. Outside, a Canada jay landed on the porch railing and looked in through the window with the opinion that this had gone on long enough and someone should put feed out. Garrett looked at the photograph. "I know," he said, to Isabel, to the dogs, to the particular quality of a May morning in Alberta when the light is new and the fields are just starting to show green. "I know." He stood up and put the photograph on the mantel, face up, where it could be seen from the kitchen and from the couch and from the wood stove, and he went and got the bird feed from the back porch and filled the feeders. The third dog was not entirely a surprise, or rather, it was a surprise. But by then Garrett had come to understand that the life he was living had a different internal logic than the life he had planned, and that these things arrived not at random but in a sequence that he was apparently the last to understand. She turned up at the end of May, a young female shepherd, full-grown, standing at the end of the gravel road in the early morning when Garrett was taking Knox out. She stood very still, which was the same thing Ridgeline had done on the highway shoulder in November, in the way that a working dog holds still when it's waiting, not as an absence of intention but as an abundance of it. She had no collar. She was healthy, well-muscled, and held herself with the particular bearing of a trained dog, the straight lines, the controlled stillness, the way her gaze moved when he approached, not looking at him but around him, checking the perimeter. Knox ran straight at her. She stood her ground and sniffed him once, and then looked back at Garrett as if to say, "This is yours?" he said. "I see you." She walked up the driveway and sat by the front door. He took her to Dr. Ma, who found a tattoo in the ear that traced back to a now-defunct working dog program that had been disbanded 2 years prior. The handling organization was gone. The records were incomplete. There was no clear owner. Dr. Ma said she could make some calls, but that honestly, in her experience with dogs from those programs, they knew where they were supposed to be. Garrett looked at the dog on the examination table, who was looking at the door with professional patience, waiting. "Okay," he said. He called her dispatch. Having 3 German shepherds in a cabin outside Cochrane, Alberta, in June, when the snow has gone and the air smells of spruce resin, and the days are long enough that it's still light at 10 o'clock, and the field behind the property has gone yellow-green, and the creek is running, and the Canada geese are back on the pond. This is either chaos or something close to purpose, depending on the morning. Most mornings it was something close to purpose. He ran the logging road with all 3, Ridgeline at his left knee, and Knox darting ahead and correcting back and darting again, and dispatch at his right a half-pace back, scanning. He split wood in the afternoons and they lay in the sun on the porch and rearranged themselves by some internal assessment as the shade moved. He cooked in the evening, proper cooking now, not the sandwiches and reheated soup of the first year, and they positioned themselves in a semicircle behind him with the combined optimism of a delegation that had not yet lost hope. He'd started talking to his brother-in-law in Ontario, Isabel's younger brother, Terence, who had called twice in the last 2 years and left messages that Garrett had not returned, and who had called in April, and this time Garrett had answered. They talked for 40 minutes about nothing much. The hockey playoffs, the road Terrence was building in his backyard, Knox's tendency to steal specific socks rather than pairs. And when they hung up, Garrett had sat in the kitchen for a moment and felt something shift that had been locked for a long time. He was not fixed. He knew that. There was no version of this in which a man puts down a loss like that and walks away clean. The weight doesn't leave. You just get stronger, eventually, and the ratio changes, and one morning you notice you've been carrying it and not thinking about it, the way you stop noticing a scar. In July, he drove to Calgary to meet Terrence, who was passing through on a work trip, and they had lunch at a Vietnamese place on 17th Avenue that Isabel had loved, and Garrett ate the broth and talked, and looked at a photograph on his phone that Terrence had taken of Isabel at their parents' house in Knox Township years ago, laughing at something off camera with the whole of herself, and he was able to look at it. When he got home, Ridgeline met him at the truck before he'd even turned off the engine. She sat beside his door until he opened it, and then she pressed her forehead against his stomach, the way she occasionally did when she had assessed that something significant had happened, and he stood in the driveway with his hand on the back of her neck, while Knox barked from the porch, because he'd been left behind and found this unjust, and Dispatch sat in the open doorway with the quiet authority of someone who had held the perimeter in everyone else's absence. The long light of the Alberta summer was going gold over the ridge. The geese on the pond were making their evening sounds. Garrett stood in his driveway and breathed in the smell of spruce and warm gravel and dog, and felt the specific weight of a life that had been broken and was not unbroken, was not and would never be unbroken, but was, against certain odds, being lived. He went inside. He fed the dogs. He turned on the radio, which was something he hadn't done in over 2 years. The CBC was doing a program about something, and the voice filled the cabin the way voices do when you've been in silence long enough that you'd forgotten they could. Knox stole a dish towel immediately and ran laps with it. Ridgeline watched him from the rug with the expression of someone who has made peace with the fact that some things will never improve. Dispatch sat by the window and watched the ridge until the light went out of it entirely, and Garrett Nolan, former Navy SEAL, widower, man of the cabin outside Cochrane who had wanted nothing but to be left alone, sat down on the couch with his coffee and his 3 dogs, and the photograph of Isabel on the mantel and the radio filling the air with ordinary human sound, and let himself be, for the first time in 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days, right here.